the Neverland.
Hello and welcome. We are the Aussie Guys. I'm AJ. Here with me is G. How are you, G?
Waiting for the coffee to kick in, AJ.
Aha. Early morning.
Early morning, coffee, grab a bite to eat so I can pop my painkillers.
Yeah.
And we're away.
But hey, you're going to enjoy this one because this is the Ravens. There's so much to talk about. Oof. And the guy we're going to get on the line is, man, his knowledge of this team is just so in-depth. He is fantastic. We had him on last year, Tony Lombardi from the Russell Street Report. And his Twitter handle is at RSR Lombardi, Lombardi. And the song that he nominated, G, so Enter Sandman, you know, he sort of, when he sent it to us, he said, you know, it's a classic. Obviously, it's a classic and maybe a little bit of an indicator of the Ravens season, like sort of builds slowly to a crescendo and then it just rocks, you know. Yeah, nice choice.
I'm looking forward to this chat because the Ravens at each position, the camp battles are going to be like spot fires everywhere it's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot going on. Anyway, let's get Tony on the line. Okay, we've got Tony on the line and he's from the Russell Street Report and his Twitter handle is at RSR Lombardi. Tony, it's fantastic to have you on again this year.
Hey, pleasure to be back, guys. Thank you.
So let's chat Ravens. So I think it's funny because when I started preparing for this, the Ravens actually had a pretty good year. I mean, they missed out on the playoffs for the third consecutive season. They actually improved on their record. They did have an 8-8 season in 2016, and they improved on that to 9-7, but they quite literally missed out on the playoffs right at the last second in a heartbreaking loss to the Bengals, week 17. It was John Harbaugh's 10th season, and it was also the 10th season with Joe Flacco, which is interesting for lots of reasons we'll dive into. But it's interesting, Tony, because when I was sort of diving into the stats, there's a whole lot of things that, you know, I didn't realise about the 2017 Ravens. I might just mention a few of them really fast, and then you can dive into some of them or whatever you'd like. So their special teams, by many measures, was the best special teams unit in the league. You know, Justin Tucker was absolute clutch, as always. Their, you know, return yards was best in the AFC, for example. Punt returns. But there's so many measures, but they were certainly the best unit. The defense was, as always, really fantastic and ranked third in the league. And Dean Pease obviously retired this offseason.
He retired, but he came back, and now he's the defensive coordinator for the Titans.
Oh, really? Okay. Alex Collins was really just out of the box. I mean, 4.6 yards per carry. We'll dive into that a little bit more. But he ranked 9th in the league in that category, and that was very surprising. The Ravens, their offense, certainly even if you look at the final final 9 games of the season, they scored 26.4 points per game, and that ranked 4th in the NFL, which is probably something which, you know, people wouldn't think of if they think of the Ravens, you know, if they put that in their mind. And the offensive line gave away 27 sacks and ranked as the 7th fewest in the NFL. And also the team gave away the 3rd fewest penalty yards in the NFL. So there's just a whole lot of stats that I just kind of lined up and thought was kind of interesting. But what's your take on 2017 as a whole, Tony?
Well, I think that if I had to go back and say, you know, what were the good things, what were the bad things, the good things were that they, despite a lot of injuries, they were able to remain competitive. And they had some guys who were down the depth chart. They were able to step up, get some significant playing time. I think that makes them a better team going forward. I think that they were fortunate in the respect that a lot of the teams that they went up against like backup quarterbacks. For instance, Green Bay. You know, they didn't face Aaron Rodgers, and there's a few other games like that. Mitch Trubisky was playing his first game on the road against the Ravens, and they ended up losing that. So the Ravens were fortunate in that regard that injuries, although they hurt themselves with injuries, they faced some teams that weren't at full strength because of some key injuries. But I guess the takeaway that I have from last year, the things that sting the most, obviously the offense and their struggles, but the defense just not being able to get off the field when it counted the most. And I think that Bengal game that you mentioned, at the outset, that's indicative of them just not being clutch in certain situations. And they should have won that game, and they didn't because the defense gave it up again. It seems like whenever Joe Flacco rallies the team late in the game to take a lead, they give it up because they leave too much time on the clock. And it's the passiveness, I think, of Dean Pease' defense time and time again, even before the Ravens, when he was with New England. If you go back and read some of the things on the internet about Dean Pease and the thoughts on him and the criticisms, they're the same criticisms as they were at the time he was in Baltimore. It was just that late in games, they started to play a little bit more passively, and teams took advantage of that. So I think the new defensive coordinator, Wink Martindale, I think he'll be a lot more aggressive, and I think that fits up and matches up better with the DNA of the Baltimore Ravens defense.
Let's look a little bit at free agency and the draft, and that'll launch us into 2018. Let's might just lump it together because there's a few things across both. So, free agency, the Ravens were pretty busy, it's fair to say. And really across both, really across the whole off-season, the Ravens have almost got a brand new, well, maybe not even almost, but they've got a brand new wide receiver core in total. So Michael Crabtree came into the building after Ryan Grant failed his physical, and I think failed might be inverted commas. Is that controversial?
I know that the Ravens really liked Ryan Grant. They liked he's a feisty player, a guy that plays like a Raven, a guy that they think the best days are ahead of him. But, he failed a physical, and there's a lot of people that believe that the Ravens thought they made a mistake with that contract that they offered Ryan Grant. They thought it was overkill, and as a result, some people were happy that that deal didn't come to fruition. But he's going to be a guy to watch and look out for. But the guy that they got, I think, that has similar skill set, and I like him better, is Willie Snead.
Mm.
And I think he's, a lot of people, before they signed Willie, there was some talk about the Ravens getting Dez Bryant. And they were in the mix, and Dez turned down a 3-year deal. It's very similar to the one that Michael Crabtree accepted. And I was glad that he turned it down and that Willie Snead was the guy because, in my opinion, if you're going to basically reconstruct that wide receiver core, those guys have to be complementary players. You can't have guys with the same skill set and doing the same kinds of things. And I think Crabtree and Dez Bryant at this point in his career, they're very similar, but Willie Snead offers something that he can play in the slot, he can play outside, and they've got John Brown, the guy that played for the Cardinals, and he's a guy that can do both those things too. So whenever you can be multiple in terms of your sets and configuration on offense, I think that makes you less predictable. And I like the Willie Snead acquisition. He's a lot more economical in his price, and I just think he's a better complement to Michael Crabtree and John Brown than Dez Bryant would have been.
Yeah, and we'll dive into the wide receivers in a little bit because I think how that sort of gets set up, and I'm not really sure. You might have some ideas, and it might be a training camp thing too. But obviously, we had Mike Wallace leaving. You couldn't hold on to your talented centre Ryan Jensen. He signed with the Bucks for $10 million a season. It was just a little bit too rich. Danny Woodhead obviously retired. Jeremy Macklin was cut, amongst other movement. But then all in the draft, let's just pop that in there, and then we can just talk about the change as a whole. So 2 first-round picks. Obviously, the first one, Hayden Hurst. He's a tight end who can just jump in and really contribute right away. And at the end of the first, Lamar Jackson. So that's something we'll dive into in a minute. But a fantastic pick there. In the third, another tight end, Mark Andrews. And I just added in a couple of wide receivers in the fourth and fifth, Jaleel Scott and Jordan Lasley. So just your feeling, free agency and the draft altogether, Tony. What did you think of Ozzie Newsome's performance?
And his last one at that too, isn't it?
Well, yeah, right, it is. I think that Ozzie did a great job of reconfiguring the roster to try to get faster, try to get more dynamic. I think in the draft they did a nice job finding some value, and Hayden Hurst he's a little bit older. He's 25 years old as a rookie, but I think that he's a grizzled guy coming out of college in terms of his experience in the limelight, because he played not just football, he played baseball as well. He was drafted by, I forgot what team it was that drafted Major League Baseball, but he's a guy, he's a really athletic guy, and they think he's a plug and play, versatile athlete. You mentioned Lamar Jackson. I'm sure you want to ask a lot about that, but Orlando Brown was projected as a first-round pick before he had a bad combine. They got him in the third. I think that he's in the right spot because, Baltimore, he's familiar with Baltimore. Baltimore's familiar with his dad. I think it's a good place for him to be. I think he'll be a starter day one. Mark Andrews, a real good receiver from the tight end position. I think he's a guy who can play outside the numbers and be a good, a guy that could come in certain sub packages. I don't think he's a starter, but I think he comes in certain sub packages and helps the team, particularly as they get close to the red zone. Anthony Averett from Alabama, defensive back, he's a nice player. I like his shiftiness, his change of direction skills. He adds some depth to what I think is already a deep cornerback rotation. So I think that's some help. Kenny Young, the linebacker from UCLA, I'm not sure about him yet because he didn't have a lot of productivity in that Pac-10. But I think that he's a guy he has good physical skills, and he's pretty fast as a linebacker. So I'm hoping that he can be a better cover guy that they've had in that linebacker position in the past. You've got Jordan Lastly from UCLA also, and Jaleel Scott from New Mexico State. Those are two guys that, they had the talent to be drafted higher, but the Ravens got them in the fourth and fifth rounds respectively, and I think that those guys are going to make the team. Deshaun Elliott, he's from Texas. He's a safety. Ravens needed some depth at safety. I was surprised that he was still on the board in the sixth round. Greg Senat is a guy I'm not real familiar with. He's from a small college called Wagner, and he's going to be a tackle in the NFL. But I think he's going to be one of those guys that gets a hangnail and he ends up on injured reserve all year, so he can kind of be a red-shirted type of rookie, and they'll get to him next year. You mentioned that the Ravens lost Ryan Jensen to free agency. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that he was too rich for them, and I don't know that Ryan Jensen's a $10 million a year player. They've been able to groom those kinds of guys in the past, and I think that Bradley Bozeman from Alabama is one of those kinds of guys that they can groom and bring him along. And a guy that they took out of a college called Ferris State. I never even heard of Ferris State. I thought maybe that's where the Ferris wheel was invented or something, but I never even heard of it. And so the guy named Zach Seiler, he's like a beast. He dominated the game at his level, and he just threw people around. He's a defensive end. He's like 6'4", 6'5", 290, just really cut up really well, and just a guy that's a physical across that defensive front. And I think in certain sub packages they can bring him along, and he could be productive as a seventh round pick. So overall, I like what they did with the draft, and I do like what they did in free agency. Ryan Jensen, losing him hurts, but I think they've got some candidates that can fill in and be a Ryan Jensen. Because let's think about it. This time last year, when we had this conversation, we didn't know who the center was going to be. The Ravens even went out and got Jeremy Zuta as a free agent, the guy they discarded a couple of years ago. They went out and got him. They thought things were so desperate. They ended up cutting him again. And then Ryan Jensen kind of won the job by default. So they didn't really know who was going to be their center, and Jensen stepped up and had himself a productive year. I think that those offensive line coaches, Joe D'Alessandris and Greg Roman, I think those two guys are very instrumental in the productivity of that offensive line. They had a lot of injuries, and they dug down deep into their depth to be able to be as productive as they are. They're a lot healthier right now, so I'm really anxious to see what those guys do with a healthy offensive line.
Before we start getting to the players in their groups, but just the influence on the Baltimore Ravens, as we know them today, of Ozzie Newsome, and this being he's retiring, and this has been his last draft. Could you just speak a little bit just about him and what he's become for the Baltimore area?
Well, I'm pretty good friends with Eric DeCosta, the assistant general manager, who will be the general manager next year. And one of the things Eric's always said to me about Ozzie is, what is it about him that you really have learned the most from, and what is it that you'd like to really emulate with him? And he said that Ozzie is extremely patient. He will not panic. He will not make a panic move, not make a panic roster move. He lets things come to him. He lets things play out. And more times than not, they end up working in his favor because of his patience. So the other thing with Ozzie is that having been a player before, I think players respect that he's a Hall of Fame tight end. He's not just a guy that played in the game. He was a Hall of Famer. And I think that has a lot of cred in the locker room when Ozzie's around. And Ozzie's looked at as the man. And I think that when you combine all that, his patience, his experience, he's been with the Ravens since day one, and he's been the general manager since 1996, which was day one for the franchise. That's a lot of experience on and off the field that really has boded well for the Ravens. Now, I would guess that he would say that he did not put on the field the best players he could have over the last couple of years because they've had some injuries and they missed on a couple of guys. But I think this year they really worked really hard as a unit. Not that they don't always, but I think knowing this was Ozzie's swan song in his last draft, where he was going to be the captain in that war room, I think they really got down and got themselves some nice players. So it remains to be seen if they did, but so far so good.
All right, so let's talk about, everybody we're going to talk about has Ozzie Newsome's fingerprints on it.
Oh, yeah.
So the QB situation to start off with. So at the moment, there are 3 in the building, and the Ravens haven't gone into a season with 3 QBs since 2009. Well, obviously, Joe Flacco was the starter there as well. So during the draft, they come back into the first round and grab the future in Lamar Jackson, which was a great move because I reckon it surprised a fair few other teams.
Mm.
They also bring in Robert Griffin Jr. before the draft. Now, is it fair to say that, to start off with, that Flacco's just a little bit salty about bringing in Lamar Jackson?
Publicly he hasn't, expressed that kind of angst or really said that he's upset about it. It's almost like business as usual. Mm-hmm. He'll say the right things that, this is a way to make the team better, and these guys make the team better. So that's what he's saying publicly. I think privately he's got to be a little jacked, and I think that bodes well for the Ravens. When Joe Flacco, when he's at his best, it's when he's got a little heat under him. Now, he's never had anybody on the sidelines that threatened his job ever since he's been in the NFL. And now he does. And, the fact that the Ravens went back into the first round to get Lamar Jackson, that's a signal. And given the fact that in 2019, the Ravens did cut ties with Joe Flacco and save money into the cap, and they've got RG3 and Lamar Jackson waiting in the wings. I think that's a surefire way to get somebody to be even more motivated. Now, Joe's healthier than he's been for probably the last 3 seasons, and he's looked really, really good in OTAs, but we'll see if that projects itself onto the field. But I like Joe Flacco under fire because I don't think anything bad can come from this. If Joe Flacco goes out and falls flat on his face and has a bad season, I don't think it's going to happen. But if he does, they got a couple of guys that can step in and play and set up for the future. If he goes out there and has a great year, and I really think he's going to have his best year as a pro in 2018, if he goes out there and does that, then they've got some options. They could keep him for another year, let Lamar Jackson continue to grow as a player, and put him in certain substitution packages, or they can trade him and get something like what the Kansas City Chiefs did with Alex Smith. They got a nice package in exchange for Alex Smith because they had Patrick Mahomes ready in the wings. And maybe that's the same thing that the Ravens will do in 2019 is to trade Joe and get something in exchange for him and have Lamar and RG3 step up and be the quarterbacks.
Joe Flacco at times has held the Ravens sort of a bit over a barrel in the quarterback, and especially when the contract's drawn up. And he has taken every possible cent he can out of the bank account. And, mate, good on him, because that's what players should do. They should get every cent they can because the quarterback's a bit longer than some, but most careers are quite short, and the danger of the game that they play. Would there be a little bit of resentment from the head office? Because we know they like money. They don't like giving players money. They like making it. They don't like giving it to players as much. Would you think, okay, there's a little bit of that involved in here?
I think that they're disappointed that Joe has not played to the level of his contract over the last 3 or 4 years. I think that certainly is at play. And I think if it wasn't, they wouldn't have made the move that they did to get back in the first round to get Lamar Jackson. So, but I do think that they believe Joe's going to have a good year. The Ravens, if they're honest with themselves, they only have themselves to blame for Joe having all the leverage in the contract negotiation. They could have gotten the deal done way before that Super Bowl, but Joe Flacco bet on himself, and he got 3 cherries on that slot machine. It came up pretty good for him, and I think that he cashed in it, and they had no choice but to sign him because in any negotiation, whether it's with NFL quarterbacks in the front office or in life, you have to negotiate from a position of leverage, and the Ravens had none.
Yep.
Had Tyrod Taylor, and at that time, Tyrod didn't have much experience. No one knew that he could be an NFL quarterback. And he certainly didn't have the same skill set as Joe Flacco, and they would have had to change the offense completely. So the Ravens, if they had to go back and do it all over again, I think a couple of things they would have done differently. Number one, they would have had more competition behind Joe, so that if they wanted to say goodbye, they could and have another guy step up. Or number two, they would have gotten a deal done for Joe a little bit earlier than they did instead of waiting to the very last minute and then having him run the table, win 4 playoff games in convincing fashion, and be the Super Bowl MVP.
How will they use Lamar Jackson at all if they use him this year? Will they get him on for some type of packages, or they just let him sit? A bit of the Patrick Mahomes sort of what they did in Kansas and Kansas City, which has been great, I think. How do you see that working out?
I think they'll find some packages for him to get him on the field a few times, and it may be something on the opponent's defense that they want to exploit, and they maybe think that Lamar Jackson can do that better than Joe in certain sub packages. So I can see them doing that. And think about this too, guys. Marty Morningweg, the Ravens offensive coordinator, was also the offensive coordinator of the Eagles when they had Donovan McNabb and Michael Vick. And they found out ways to get Michael Vick in the game in certain sub packages so that when Donovan McNabb actually, I think he was either got hurt or got pulled because they're having a bad season, when Michael Vick stepped back on the field, he was ready to go, and they didn't miss a beat. In fact, that he took them to the playoffs. So I think that maybe Marty has learned from that experience, and I definitely think that Lamar Jackson he'll probably dress every week, and he'll be on the field probably every week in some fashion because he's too good of an athlete to keep on the sidelines for 16 games, that's for sure.
So do they go into this coming season with 3 quarterbacks? Do they keep RG3? Because John Harbaugh's been really impressed the way that he's handled himself on and off the field, which is something that RG3 hasn't done in the past.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've asked that of some people around the Ravens, and the vibe I get is that they're ready to go to war with 3 quarterbacks this year. And here's why. Although they haven't said this to me, I've sort of read between the lines and developed my own conclusion. I think if Joe does struggle, I don't think they want to put Lamar out there right away. I think they'd rather RG3 be that guy to take that heat. He's battle tested. He's been down this road before. So I think that they'd rather turn to him in the event that Joe struggles instead of RG3. Instead of Lamar Jackson. And here's the other thing too. RG3, think about him coming out of Baylor and going to the Washington Redskins. His style of play is very similar to the style of play of Lamar Jackson. So why not have a guy in that quarterback room that understands Lamar Jackson's skill set, maybe sees the game similarly to Lamar Jackson, and that would be RG3, because certainly Joe Flacco athletically is nowhere near the athlete that Lamar Jackson is, and nor is Lamar Jackson near the athlete that Joe Flacco is from the perspective of a pocket passer and being able to throw the ball down the field. When you watch these two in practice together, Joe Flacco's arm's so much stronger than Lamar Jackson's.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, an RG3 could actually teach Lamar Jackson, this is what happens to you if you don't learn how to go down, run out of bounds.
Right.
I'm a prime example.
Right. I think that's valuable information because you can't see the game through. Lamar can't see the game through Joe's eyes, and Joe can't see the game through Lamar's eyes because they're vastly different skill sets.
Yep.
But RG3, I think, can really help, and I think having him around will accelerate the development of Lamar Jackson.
Okay, we'll move on to the RBs, and Alex Collins comes in from Seattle, and they must be absolutely kicking themselves at the moment. They didn't give this guy a bit more of a chance with their woes that they have in the backfield up there. And maybe if he would have been bitten by the injury bug like so many of them.
If he'd stayed.
If he had stayed. But Mate, to be honest, he surprised people, didn't he? He ended the season with 973 yards, 6 TDs in just 12 starts. Now you have Javorius Allen, who's in his 4th season, and he's been a very reliable second guy for the Ravens. Now, behind him, you have Kenneth Dixon. Now, this is where it's all going to get interesting, I think, in the backfield, is that he's flashed as a rookie. He missed his season last year with the knee injury, which was a meniscus tear, which worked out to be worse than they thought. So it was season-ending surgery, and he did that while he was working out at his old Alameda in Louisiana Tech. And they obviously like this guy. He's off field with the 4-game ban for PEDs, which he got an extra 2 for violating the substance abuse policy, which he served while he was injured. They've kept him round through all of that. He's very appreciative. He said how many times that he's just owes a debt to the Ravens for sticking by him. And mate, he has everything you need in a back. He's powerful, he's quick, he's shifty, and let's face it, if it wasn't for everything that happened to him with the injury, he could have been Alex Collins last year for the Ravens. So how do you see the backfield working out?
It'll be interesting to see how it does work out, because Buck Allen, even as a backup guy last year, as a guy who would be that 2 in the 1-2 punch,
Yep.
He did a nice job last year, particularly in between the tackles. In running situations, he protects the football better. How I see it working out, Kenneth Dixon, I'm a big fan of Kenneth Dixon's, and I think if he can stay healthy and stay clean, I think that he's a guy that could be a big difference maker for the Ravens. I like Alex Collins. He's a good guy. He's a good man, and he's a guy that really fits in well with the way that Greg Roman likes to operate that running game. So it's competition, and teams get better when there's heavy competition at key positions. And when you've got 3 guys that can really make a difference in that backfield, I think having all 3 together makes the Ravens a better team. Who emerges? I have this feeling that Kenneth Dixon, before all is said and done, is going to be the guy. And there's 2 reasons why I say that. Number one, I think this Greg Roman offense is perfect for his skill set inside the tackles. Like you mentioned, he's a shifty guy, and I think that he changes direction really well for a guy who's as big and powerful as him. Plus, he's a really good receiver. If you look back to his days at Louisiana Tech in college, I think he had like 97 touchdowns, and many of those were catching the ball out of the backfield and just running in the open field. So I think he's a dynamic player. The one thing about Alex Collins that I would watch for, because I really like the guy, he sometimes puts the ball on the ground, and John Harbaugh will not stand for that. And if that happens early in the season, and I think it could, there could be a quick shift to Kenneth Dixon. And I think that either one of them is going to be a good number 1 back, but I think having both together makes them a better football team.
Yeah, it's interesting you say how much you like Kenneth Dixon and what it might end up, because my question was, the season's going to start one way with Collins obviously being the guy to start the season and Allen and Dixon fighting out as a second guy for now, but the season could end totally different. And look, it usually does in the backfield, doesn't it, just with the way that the position that it is and the injuries that happen.
Yeah, and the thing with Javorius Allen is that he's a guy that really contributes on special teams as well. And that's important when you have a guy who's a second or third string running back to contribute on special teams. I don't know that Kenneth Dixon's going to be that guy, but I'm pretty sure that Buck Allen can be that guy.
Yep.
And he has been.
Okay, so the wide receivers, as AJ brought up at the start, you got a whole new sort of, not a whole new, but it is a new look for the starters anyway, with Crabtree. Opposite him will be John Brown, who comes in from the Cards. As you said, you're a fan of getting Willie Snead, and he'll come out of the slot. But the receivers you keep on, Chris Moore's there. He'll go into his 3rd season. Look, he showed late at the end of last season, and he's impressed during the OTAs at the start of this season. Brashard Perryman goes into his 4th season. The injuries continue to plague him for the start of his career, and he's a first-round pick. Before we get into everybody else, is he like a bubble candidate at the moment?
He's totally a bubble candidate, and he's got a bonus that's due to him. I want to say it's right around the 2nd of August. I could be wrong on that date, but he's got a bonus that's due to him that will impact the cap immediately. It's not a big bonus. I think it's something in the $750,000 range, something like that. But not big by NFL standards, to put it that way. And so I think that what he does prior to that, because the Ravens have an early camp this year. They start on July 19th because they're playing 5 preseason games this year, the first of which is on August the 2nd, I think. And here comes that date again. That's a Thursday. And that's the Hall of Fame game because Ray Lewis's induction. They're playing against the Bears. And so that I think that him getting into camp a little earlier gives them more on-the-field reps to determine whether they want to keep him or not. I don't think he's going to stay around. I just think that there's something about the guy. Sometimes he's looked unbelievable in practice. But Cam Cameron, the Ravens offensive coordinator years ago, he said something one year when, I'm trying to think who looked really good. It'll come to me in a second. But there was a receiver that looked really good, and people, the media were commenting on that. They said that he's looking really good as a receiver. There was a kid out of Indiana that Joe Flacco wanted the Ravens to pick that they did. God, why is his name escaping me? I can picture him clear as day. Anyway, he was out on the field making great plays during practice. And Cam Cameron said, let's see what happens when we introduce the threat of contact. And that always stuck with me because when you're out there in shorts and T-shirts and a helmet and you're making great plays, knowing that you're not going to get hit going over the middle, then that's a different story than when you introduce that threat of contact and all of a sudden those alligator arms come into play. You don't make the catch. You look upfield. You look for the defender before you catch the ball. And I think Rashad Perryman's guilty of some of that. And I don't know how much of a student he is of the game, but he just looks lost out there sometimes. Fundamentally speaking, he just hasn't developed at all. There's a lot of fast guys in the NFL, but that's pretty much all he is a fast guy. He doesn't have dependable hands. He doesn't run good routes. I think with all this competition coming in, and because he doesn't do anything on special teams, I think he's going to be out.
All right, so the rookies you've AJ just quickly went over was Jordan Lasley and Jaleel Scott. Now, I really like Lasley, and I actually like Scott coming out. They were sort of like guys that weren't really spoke about a lot with a lot of pundits in this rookie class. But Lasley's going to surprise a few people, and Jaleel Scott, mate, like 6'5" receiver down in the red zone, and the dude can go out. So by the time he goes up, he's 10 foot plus. So
right.
The wide receiving core wasn't that great last year. Wasn't a great stat line with finishing the season 29th in passing yards, 32nd in yards per attempt, and 29th in yards per game. So with the guys coming in, we spoke about with Crabtree, John Brown's another one you have to watch. He doesn't step on the field unless he feels he's 100%, and Willie Snead. But what are the possibilities for the receivers?
Well, I think because there's so many new faces, their challenge is going to be getting on the same page. How do you get all those guys on the same page? I think that's going to be a challenge. You know, they're all new. They have flipped the entire wide receiver room except for Chris Moore and Rashad Perryman. And one of those, as we just said, probably isn't going to be on the team. Chris Moore he's a really good special teams player, so he brings value to the team other than just being a wide receiver. And right now, I think at wide receiver, I think Chris Moore is a better player than Rashad Perryman. So I think that how it's going to play out, the new guys are going to play, or they're going to make the team. There's going to be 5 new guys, a 6th receiver being Chris Moore. You've got 2 new tight ends. You've got Kenneth Dixon, who doesn't have a lot of time with Joe Flacco. A lot of new guys that are going to have to get on the same page in a hurry. I think the Ravens are a better offensive team probably from the halfway point going forward than they are early in the season because of, they just have to get those reps together. And I don't think, given the new collective bargaining agreement, they get enough of those. They do benefit, though, from having that one extra preseason game. And I think that you'll see Joe Flacco playing a little bit longer during preseason games just to get that rapport with all those new guys.
Now, you quickly touched on some new tight ends coming in. So Ben Watson leaves in free agency. He's gone back to the Saints. And he leaves a big hole because he was your team's leading receiver last year. So 522 yards, 4 TDs, walks out the door. Max Williams is still there, 4th season. Also Nick Ball in his 4th season. They combined last year for 43, 289 and 1 TD. But it'd be fair to say that there are probably more blocking tight ends. So you draft Hayden Hurst, who's as AJ said, he's a ready-to-go tight end with his maturity. Probably the best ready-to-go tight end in this class by a mile. You also take Mark Andrews, who's a much bigger guy, a red zone threat, but needs work on his blocking. So would it be fair to say that Hayden would be the guy to fill the shoes? Because we know the Ravens really like the tight end packages, and they've always used the tight end. So how are you reading it all play out?
It'll be one of the most interesting camp battles to watch is what happens at tight end. I think that the most well-rounded tight end of all those is Hayden Hurst. I think Andrews could be the best pass catcher of all those guys. Nick Boyle is the best blocker, and they've used him in some situational sub-packages as an H-back, and he's done really well. So I think he's a valuable asset in that he does some different things. The guy I'm not sure of is Max Williams, who they moved back into the second round. It was in 2015 and picked him. And I think that, he's got a lot to prove because he's been injured a lot. When he's been out on the field, he really hasn't been that productive. And when you see him in practice, he's just kind of a plodder. He doesn't really move that quickly. I don't know that he runs the greatest routes. So I think he, of all those four, probably is the one most likely closest to the bubble. I still think he makes the team, but because they do like to use a lot the tight ends, 2 and 3, sometimes even 3 tight ends with Greg Roman. But I do think that he'll make the team. But I think if any of them are cut as a surprise, I think that Max Williams is the guy that would be let go.
Yeah. So if they go the 3 quarterback route, someone's got to miss out somewhere. Someone's got to be cut. Could it be Max Williams take this guy out of the tight end position and say, see you later because we've got to make room for RG3?
It's possible. And let's say that Perryman has a great camp and they start to say to themselves, we might have to keep 7 receivers. Because I think if they cut loose those guys like Lashley and Scott, I think somebody will pick those guys up. And somebody will definitely pick up Moore because Moore's such a solid special teams guy. So, you don't think of a guy who is a receiver threatening a position that maybe is a linebacker, but in fact they do because there's so many roster spots that you can keep these guys, and it really gets tough when you get down to that final 53. So I could see Max Williams being the guy that goes, and unless because he doesn't really do much on special teams either. When you have a 4th string tight end, that guy's got to be playing special teams. If he's not, there's got to be some other reason that they're going to keep him around. But I'm just not seeing it right now. So yeah, all those things get to that final 53. Those guys on the bubble, special teams will make the difference between those guys staying or not.
For sure. Now the O-line. So you loaded up in the draft to make this probably the deepest group of guys you have on the whole roster in Baltimore. Unfortunately, injury struck in 2017. Probably no harder than losing Marshall Yonder. Along with him, you also you lost Alex Lewis and Nico Saragusa. But they're all back this season. There's going to be some serious camp battles going on with everybody that you've brought in. So how do you see winning the starting roles on a line that's probably going to be possibly the greatest strength of this team?
Well, I think the starting unit it'll be interesting. The question mark is who's going to play center. We don't know that yet. Is it Matt Skura? I don't think that Skura is a guy who has the kind of weight that you need. He doesn't anchor down at that position the way the Ravens configure their blocking scheme, the way Ryan Jensen did. So I think he can get pushed around a little bit unless they scheme it differently because they've got a lighter center. But I think the center position is going to be the one that I'm going to be probably watching most closely. Now, Alex Lewis, his name has been mentioned as a possible candidate for center because Marshall Yonder's coming back. He played right guard. Perhaps James Hurst plays left guard. And you've got Ronnie Stanley out there at left tackle and the rookie Orlando Brown at right tackle. So Nico Saragusa, maybe he's in the mix as a center candidate. I'm not sure. And then you've got the rookie Bozeman that you probably don't want a rookie center making the line calls at the NFL level. So I think he's a reserve this year. But I've been saying this for a while, and I can't get anybody from the Ravens to really confirm if it's a possibility. but it would not shock me if the center ends up being Marshall Yonda. He's such a good player. He could play. He makes the line calls already when he's in the game. So I don't think it's that big of a transition for him, unless you find out that he can't snap it out of a shotgun, and then it changes the complexion of things. I think Marshall Yonda is so versatile. He's played every position on that offensive line except center and left tackle. And I have a feeling they probably could play either one of them pretty well because he's that good of a lineman.
Now that we've gone across the whole of the offense, it's just amazing the amount of camp battles that are be going on at each position.
That's the front office's job, is to find competition, to create competition throughout the roster, because that makes you better. And, if they have a plethora of guys that they want, that they can't make on the 53-man roster, well, then maybe they use their strengths to beef up a position of weakness. Maybe if it's one of those offensive linemen, or maybe if it's one of those defensive backs, because I think they're pretty deep back there too, that they don't think that they can keep all these guys. Maybe they use that as part of a trade to help them in what I think is the weakest position on the field. That's inside linebacker. So because they need somebody next to C.J. Mosley, and C.J. has been terrible at coverage, and can cover a corpse with a blanket. But he's just a guy that he needs help, and maybe it's scheme, maybe it's, I think Martindale does some different things, but I think that if I was dealing from a position of strength, you want to fortify a position of weakness, and I think that's the first place I'd look at. That'd be inside linebacker.
I'm going to use that. That was great. Can't cover a corpse. I'm writing that right down as we speak, Tone. That is fantastic. You don't mind if I use it in future dates? I'll cover a corpse with a blanket.
I don't know where I heard that before, but I always like it, and I've always used it. So I can't put my name next to the author. So go ahead and, imitation's the finest flattery, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, that's fantastic.
Now, that's a beautiful transition to the defense. And when I was sort of looking at everything, Tony, I sort of thought, well, linebacker is probably the area where maybe we'll talk for the most part, because the D-line looks pretty set, to be honest. Brandon Williams, Michael Pierce, Brent Urban, and behind them, Henry, Davis, and Wormley. So that looks like a good unit, and it looks pretty set. And then at linebacker, there's some good names. So obviously you've got Suggs and Bowser, for example, and you've got Mosley and Onwusa, and Kenny Young, of course, who you drafted. So it's interesting to think about how that's going to shape out in camp. And a guy that we spoke about last year, or you were really high on last year, I don't know if you remember mentioning it on this pod, but Correa, who we thought, or you sort of nominated as a step-up player, actually. We thought that he was going to really grab that, maybe one of those inside backer spots and just run with it, and it hasn't really panned out, and he might even be on the bubble. But what are your thoughts at linebacker?
Yeah, it's a tough position. I'll just focus on the inside. You got Onwusa, you got Kenny Young, and you got C.J. Mosley, and they're moving Correa back outside. That's where they drafted him, as an outside guy on the edge who can get to the quarterback, and they're moving him back outside. So the interior linebacker, it would not surprise me. He always talks about the roster, the transition of the roster. It's not complete until the day we step on the field to play the Buffalo Bills. And I think with this year being with the Ravens, it's like any other season, I have a feeling there's going to be some veteran that falls off some other roster that ends up on the Ravens roster that could fit into the scheme that Wink Martindale's going to run. But if that doesn't happen, then Rosso has to step up, and then Kenny Young, maybe he's the guy. Or maybe what they do is schematically in passing situations, they get one of those guys off the field and they drop Tony Jefferson down as a roving type of linebacker in a cover, in quarters or a dime package, and drop him down there to cover tight ends and running backs out of the backfield. So whatever they do, it could be schematically or it could be a veteran they pick up. I think that's what they got to focus on, is fixing that inside linebacker position. And I think that's the way they'll go about it, because Ozzie has a history of finding these guys late in camp that plug in and play nicely. Darryl Smith was one of those guys a few years back, and on the offensive line, he's found guys that play right tackle late in camp, and I think he'll do the same thing this year with inside linebacker.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that. I was going to ask you and sort of float that idea about Tony Jefferson, because the defensive backfield has got good depth, with Jimmy Smith and Brandon Carr and then Weddle and Jefferson. And, I mean, that seems to be a fairly popular trend in the NFL these days, just run tons of nickel. I mean, there's tons of defenses that are, weak in the middle, and, you're strong at the front and you're strong at the back. So it kind of seems like a bit of a logical progression.
Yeah, I mean, they've got some talent there. You've got, Averett, the guy they drafted from Alabama. He's a nice player. They're bringing back Tavon Young, who had a terrific rookie season in 2016. He blew out his ACL during training camp last year, but he's coming back, and he's said to be strong. Marlon Humphrey came on really strong at the end of last year, and now they're saying that Jimmy Smith is just he's like they're calling him Wolverine because he's bouncing back so quickly from that injury to his Achilles. And, he's out there running around. And so they think he's going to be ready to go for the start of the season. So you add up all these guys, and, there's some depth there. So I think the defensive backfield, they drafted Deshaun Elliott, the guy that was projected to go earlier in the 6th round for sure. He's the guy that can help them back there. And they've got a couple other guys who could potentially play safety, at least fill in behind Jefferson and Weddle.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just quickly, now that we've covered the team, Tony, if you sat down and you had to fix your camera on one position for the Ravens that you'd want to watch in camp, what would it be? Which battle?
Well, there's a few, but it's always wide receiver for this team. Who's going to step up, and what kind of rapport can the Ravens and Joe Flacco develop with those wide receivers? If he can get that going, I'm confident that the running game will be even better than it was last year. I'm confident the offensive line will be better. And if you can play from a lead, it allows you to be better defensively. So I think what they do at wide receiver, if they can be productive, that can be a productive unit. I think that changes everything for the team, because if you're playing with a 10 or 14-point lead, that makes playing defense a lot easier, because it makes the other team one-dimensional. They're going to have to throw the football. You just come after the quarterback and you put a different personnel package out there. So I think that's the one position I'll watch really closely. And the other one I keep coming back to it, but I think it's important for the team, is that inside linebacker. Who's going to step up? But the thing is, you really don't see how it's going to shake out during practice, because they're so limited in terms of contact. And during the preseason games, they're not really drawing up a scheme to beat the other team. They're just out there getting their reps in. So you don't really get a sense of how it's going to work out. And unfortunately, you don't know until the regular season. But I think wide receiver and inside linebacker are the positions I'm most interested in, because I think those two, if they can play well, the Ravens are going to be in good shape.
Yep. Okay, now this is going to be a tough call, Tony, and so you can sort of pass. We won't hold you to it, but I was going to say, how do you think they're going to go this year? It's such a tough thing to quantify, and certainly there's a lot of pieces in place, but there's a lot of moving pieces as well.
Yeah, it is tough to quantify, but I just have this gut feeling, and I've been very critical of Joe Flacco, but I have this gut feeling that he's going to have a good year this year, and I think that's going to bode well for the Ravens. I don't think there's a lot of dominant teams in the AFC. And I think that there's even some holes in the Pittsburgh Steelers that, they're pretty much universally expected to be the first place team in the AFC North. But I'm not so sure. But I think the Ravens are going to be anywhere from where they were last year at 9-7, 11-5. I think they're going to fall somewhere in there. And if I had my gun to my head, I'm going to say I'm going to go right in between at 10-6. They'll be a wild card team. But the thing I'll like best about that is, I think if they get there and they're back in the playoffs, I think they'll be back in the playoffs for a few years to come, because I think that if they come together and they're a playoff team in 2018, I think the best is yet to come for this particular roster. And I think in 2019, they can really make some noise.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're right in that, the Steelers would be the favoured team in the division, but the Steelers-Ravens rivalry is one of the best rivalries in the entire league, and when you've got rivalries like that, it almost doesn't matter who's on the roster of the particular teams, does it? It's just like it's a dogfight every year.
It's a great question, and I compare it too. I think it is the best rivalry in football, but you can look back at the history, and if the Ravens were a 6-10 team one year and the Steelers were 13-3, they probably split the games anyway.
Yeah.
And vice versa. So it's just one of those rivalries where they know each other so well, and a lot of times and I can't even say it's the home field that shifts things, because the Ravens have won a lot at Heinz Field and the Steelers have won a lot in M&T Bank Stadium. So it just comes down to playing that game, and usually the games are like decided by 3 points. So it comes down to one possession so many times. And if you look at the years when the Chicago Bears were really good and the Green Bay Packers were not so good, they were still that's that rivalry, and they still had these battles. So I think when you're in division and you have that rivalry, anybody can win. I don't care what your record is.
Yep, precisely. Now this year we're changing things up slightly. We're asking our guests to nominate who they think is a locker room guy. So I don't want to say we've been sort of using the word like a rah-rah guy, but it's not really.
You've been using the rah-rah guy. I saw the motivational guy, the guy that sort of binds the locker room together, the player that people will follow.
Well, I think a couple of locker room guys like that, Marcianda, they really, a couple of years back, I remember the Ravens were just wrapping up a practice. And they all gathered around, and they were standing around Marcianda. Usually when a player kind of speaks, the guys are kind of kidding around and whatnot. But you could have heard a pin drop, because I think they respect Marcianda, because he's fought through so many injuries and still played at a Pro Bowl level year in and year out, and continues to do that. I think that he's not the rah-rah guy, but he's a guy that when he walks in that locker room, he's got some swagger, he's got some juju, and he's a guy that they all look up to. A guy that's a little bit more rah-rah on the other side of the ball is certainly Terrell Suggs. And believe it or not, he's done a great job of being a leader. And I never thought he could be, because when they had Ed Reed and Ray Lewis and Terrell Suggs all together, it was like Terrell Suggs was the class clown. And I don't mean it in a disparaging way. I think that you need that kind of levity in your locker room sometimes when things are often so high pressure and serious, that you have a little levity. I think it makes you a better team, and he served that role. But I think it's difficult to migrate from the class clown to the leader, but he's done a really good job of that. And beside him on the defensive side, I would say that Eric Weddle is another leader. He's a guy who the coaching staff just loves. They confer with him. He's one of those guys that if he spends time with the coaching staff, the teammates don't look at it in like a brown-nosing kind of way. And when he's out there with his teammates, they just respect him. So I think those three guys are the kind of players that just carry a lot of respect in that locker room. And I think that when things are going badly, those are the guys that step up and try to get their guys back on track. And I think they do a good job of that.
Tony, it's been fantastic chatting to you. And as always, your knowledge and depth of knowledge of the team is absolutely first rate. We've got certainly lots of sort of pages of notes here. We haven't sort of needed them.
Well, thank you very much for your time and for having me on.
Well, that was fantastic. So much detail, G.
Oh, it's a snowball effect, isn't it? You just start something small, roll it down the mountain, and it just keeps getting bigger just with the amount of information that he gives you. Mate, just talk about wide receivers and just don't even ask him a question and let him go.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
As Tony outlined, there's so many camp battles that are going to be going on in Ravens training camp. It's going to be certainly one of the ones to watch really closely. And it is really hard to kind of pick how the Ravens are going to do. I mean, who knows? There's so much change.
Mate, he's going to be packing up that deck chair pretty quick, sitting between what's in the wide receivers, which is the two that he mentioned, and the inside linebackers.
Yeah.
How that all works out.
Well, just the whole linebacker position. Yeah. So, yeah, fantastic. All right, okay, another one in the books, G. And thanks for listening once again. Hope you're enjoying our team preview series. On behalf of G and myself, we'll catch you next time.